When I agreed to do these masterclasses, I didn't realize how much of a production it would be, even for material that I felt I was extremely familiar with. But it's been a very pleasant and extremely interesting time for me, because I've heard from so many people who are hearing this material for the first time and have asked extremely challenging questions. And I look forward to the same today as well. I might not take an entire hour, but I hope that gives us time for a longer conversation. I have, of course, been discussing various kinds of reaction to colonialism, because the entire period that I have discussed is, of course, the period of colonialism, starting with the forms of oppression and also including the experience of colonialism as humiliation. And today I'm actually going directly to a nationalist upsurge, which I have so far not actually discussed, in order to demonstrate that very different kinds of things were happening in different parts of India in response to the call of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and especially in 1942, when he appeared to be losing control of the national movement. But before I get to that, let me also say a word about sources, because the primary source for what I have been able to write about this particular event has been the judicial record. I did begin the series of lectures by saying that the historian's reading of the judicial record is not in order to establish criminality, but in order to be able to evaluate the actors of their times, the kinds of conceptions of the world that come through in this incitement to talk that is the courtroom. The courtroom actually interrogates people who have involuntarily collided with the law and who are forced to make in their depositions certain statements which actually describe, of course, the interest of the judge is in order to establish the prehistory of crime. The interest of the historian is very, very different. It's, as I said, to be able to detect in these subaltern voices the kinds of conceptions of the world which were dear to these people whom you normally do not hear from, because for the large part they were illiterate. They were not people who had access to forms of recording their experiences and so on and so forth. So the judicial record has become a very useful and extremely valuable archive for historians of the social life of the poor and the marginal historians such as myself. But as I said, the methods of the judge and the historian are quite different. We learn to read these documents not in order to condemn or punish, but in order to understand certain social processes and in order to make a persuasive argument that might be very different from the one that courts and judges make. So let me start by saying that in 1970, when Virendra Patil, who was the Chief Minister of Karnataka at the time, it was not yet named Karnataka, Mysore, announced that he was going to give a, money, he was going to, I think it was 1 lakh, for a memorial at Isoor in 1970, journalists were flummoxed because they had no clue why that place was significant and what was the important event that was being commemorated. Clearly, that event of 1942 did not become a metaphor, as Shahid Amin has described the events surrounding Chauri Chaura. Chauri Chaura in 1922, when mob violence actually killed 22 policemen and 3 civilians, became the turning point, as some of you may know, in the non-cooperation movement led by Gandhi. He abruptly called it off, saying, this is not what I had in mind. I had a non-violent protest in mind. And it's historic for the simple reason that it was the peasantry that was involved in that act of mob violence. And it has been extremely well researched and documented by Shahid Amin, among others. But Isoor has not taken its place in equal terms as a metaphor or even as a memory. As I said, journalists were hard pressed to try and find out what it is that Virendra Patil was actually hoping to commemorate in his grant of the money for the memorial. And at the same time, I won't have time to go into those details here, but 1942 was an interesting moment because the entire top leadership of the national movement was put into jail within days. By August 9th, practically every member of the top leadership was in jail because, as you know, it was during the Second World War and no risks could be taken of a massive uprising. But in fact, a massive uprising is indeed what happened. And it happened through different other kinds of leadership at lower levels. And in this case, actually, in a very, very specifically local village level, to the extent that you had also, for instance, in September, by September, the participation of large numbers of workers in Quit India struggles. Students were some of the mainstay of the Quit India struggle. And you had the establishment, at least in 4 places that have been studied by historians, of independent sarkars, prati sarkars as they're called. One is Talcher, one is Tamluk, one is Satara, and one was in Orissa as well. These independent sarkars actually continued for, in some cases, for 3 years till the end of the war period, that is from 42 to 45. So they really were parts of India that believed that they had already achieved independence. Now, the question that I want to start by asking, and by the way, when I was looking for a suitable image here, I found this rather charming mural by Biohar Ram Manohar Sinha. I don't know who this person is, from 1952, but it is showing you something that is actually both true of Quit India and also not necessarily true of the particular instance that I'm talking of, which is a heroic sort of battling of ordinary people with the police. They have taken down, as you can see, the telegraph wires, which was very, very common in the Quit India movement, dismantled the railway line, again, common in the Quit India movement, and leading, Prabhat ferries in all likelihood, and facing very frontally the power of the state. I'm just showing you also a map of where Isoor is in relation to the nearest big town, which is Shikaripur. That's just for your, and it's in Shimoga district. So we're back to Shimoga, where my peasant rebellion of the 1830s also happened. Here is what Gandhi said in his call to join the 1942 movement. He said, everyone is free to go to the fullest extent under ahimsa. Complete deadlock by strikes and other non-violent means. Satyagrahis must go out and die, not to live. They must seek and face death. It is only when individuals go out to die that the nation will survive. Karenge ya marenge. Now, the question that many historians have asked, including Gyan Pandey, is how did karenge ya marenge, or karo ya maro, turn into its exact opposite, which is karo ya maro? And that's indeed what happens in the case of Isoor. How did this message get transformed into its exact opposite? Why were forms of violence so central to what happened in the 42 movement? What was the kind of disconnect that had happened between what Gandhi gave in his message and what was understood and translated into many different locations all across India? But in order to answer that question, we have to understand what is Isoor, what kind of village was Isoor. So let me just say a few words about the village that we learn, as I said, from this voluminous record, the court record, which is examining, witness after witness and accused of defendants and so on and so forth. It was a small prosperous, multi-caste village with 400 or 500 houses, maybe a 2,000 population at the time. The entire area was studded with kattes, or little tanks, and lush fields of paddy and sugarcane, especially because just shortly before 1942, between 1935 and 1939, there had been a nice irrigation project which was established there, the Anjanapur project, and it therefore allowed people to actually grow sugarcane, which, as you know, requires large quantities of water. Predominantly, it was Lingayats who were the landowners and the money lenders. They were both landowners and sahukars. And as it was discovered in the course of the court proceedings, they were among the people who were paying the highest revenue, between 1,500 and 2,000 as assessment. They were also culturally, and so it was not just economic power that we are talking about, they were also culturally extremely powerful, associated as they were with two very important Lingayat mathas, the Balehalli Matha and the Sirigere Matha. Now, one of these very important leaders of the town, of the village, Rachavalli Rudrappa, there was a big fire in 1928 which swept through the village. And I'll tell you one of the exceptions to that fire damage that one notes. Many of the Lingayat homes were damaged and razed to the ground, but he was wealthy enough to be able to donate something like 40 acres of land to rebuild the village. Therefore, the big men of the village, himself, that is Rachavalli Rudrappa, plus Baswanappa, were actually very influential, obviously. People relied on their patronage and so on, not just for the fact that they were, in houses that were rebuilt after this fire, but because they patronized various other kinds of activities as well. The fire of 1928, however, did not, for some completely inexplicable reason, touch the homes of the Wadars and the lower castes. For some reason, the lower castes were spared from this particular catastrophic event. I'm saying this because the fire of nationalism also somehow seems to have bypassed the lower castes. They were not really as involved in the national movement as the middle and the middle castes and definitely the upper castes. So in Isoor, there was also a very substantial weaving community, but majority of the people of Isoor were landless. They were either working as laborers or they were leasing in land, etc. There were 50 families of Wadars and Adi Karnatakas, that is, say, scheduled castes, some Muslim families. And the other castes, the sort of intermediate castes, included people who were Devangas, Vishwa Brahmins, Muslims, Kurubas, and so on and so forth. One of the interesting things that comes through to us was the factional fighting that would go on in a small village like this between the Nonabas and the Sadra Lingayats. So these were two sets of Lingayats who owed their allegiance to two different mathas, and who were respectively the moneylender sahukar or the patel of the village. There was dominance, but there were two different types of dominance. One was obviously the economic dominance and associated cultural dominance as well. The patel was the more official, bureaucratic kind of dominance. And these grievances and these faction quarrels were allowed to flower within the courtroom, and that's how we actually learn about it. Now, I said, so that's so much, I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch of what the village was, what the social structure of the village was, and so on, so you get an idea of why exactly you had, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. The message of Gandhi transformed somewhat. You can see this in this 4-point Gandhian message that was chalked up on the walls of the temple, which was the epicenter of the struggle in Isoor. Don't pay kandaya, that is revenue. That was a fairly standard nationalist demand. Cut teakwood trees, because that would then, obviously cut, the revenues of the government again. don't pay tolls, etc., cut the wires, that is to say the telegraph wires, relatively, harmless things. But then it says, let there be unity, let government servants be cut to pieces. Riot brethren, be united and give up communal differences. Now this mixture of exhortations, this idea that, you have to not pay the rent, not pay the revenue, that you have to disrupt governmental communications through the cutting of wires and the disrupting of railway tracks and so on and so forth, breaking of bridges and culverts. These were all the elements that went into the violence that formed part of the 1942 Quit India movement, was also accompanied by this call to let government servants be cut to pieces. And that was certainly not Gandhi's, message at all, as we know. But we see a very direct kind of inversion of his message of ahimsa. And let's go now to what the slogans were that were chalked up on the walls of the Veera Bhadraswamy temple in Isoor. It's here, please let us also recall that this is a police translation of what was the evidence which would go into the indictment of these people who were accused of the murders. Brother riots, learn Hindi. So this is one of the first things that they seem to be saying. May God grant independence and victory to India. The suffering of the riots is the suffering of India, and their happiness is the happiness of India. All contempt to traitors, Vande Mataram. Let English schools be closed and let Britishers be imprisoned. Don't drink toddy, which of course was one of the Gandhian messages right from the time of the non-cooperation movement, which makes you unsteady. Everyone wants independence. Don't smoke cigarettes and BDs. The government servants, and now we're coming directly again to the government servants. They are unfit to sit here. Don't offer them mats or chairs, and because we are free, we don't need to pay respect to government servants, and the houses of those who respect them will be set on fire by us. So, watch out. Government servants are the slaves of riots. India is independent. Now, I'm giving you this sense of what was actually said on the walls, because the temple was not just a religious place. It was also a place which was the center of all such public meetings that happened in the village, including multi-caste and across religions. So that was actually a meeting place. And this kind of call to rebellion against the government, and remember that this is all happening in the princely state of Mysore. So it's not British-ruled India that we're talking about. It is the princely state of Mysore. So when we say government, we're actually talking about the Mysore government. Now, what we have here is, so let me just run you through what kinds of activities led up to this particular declaration of independence and then to the denouement in the form of the actual lynching. The events were varied. Let me just hold it there. There were Prabhat Fairies. Prabhat Fairies are these groups of singing people who go around from house to house singing nationalist songs and so on every morning, and hence Prabhat, and ending up at the temple, but not before they had made a pit stop at the sahukar's house. So Sahukar Baswanappa was the key person whose house this Prabhat Fairy would stop at. His first wife would actually bless the group that was doing the Prabhat Fairy, and then they would return to the headquarters of the struggle, which was the temple. At this time, this was accompanied by other kinds of activities, such as cutting of sandalwood and toddy trees, sandalwood being the monopoly of the Mysore government, telephone wires, damaging culverts and bridges, setting fire to the post office, etc. So various other forms of violence, but against government property. It is as yet not something that is violence that has been inflicted on people. But as the judge would say, these are all, he said that these are all fairly serious kinds of activities and, not necessarily childish pranks. Why did he say that? Let me explain to you that the leaders of this struggle were four people who were called Sahukar Baswanappa, Sahukar Rachavali Rudrappa, I've already referred to both of them, Shantavirappa, who was the son of Rachavalli Rudrappa, and Angri Halappa. These were the 4 key leaders. All of them were Lingayats, all of them were wealthy landowners, all of them were dominant in the village. But the parallel government, which was declared on September 25th, was run by 2 youngsters, very young children, Amaldar Jayappa, who was 10 years old, the son of Basavanappa, and Sub-Inspector K.G. Malappa, who was another 12-year-old member of a sahukar family. So this is why the judge says, you know, this is all activity that seems to go well beyond any kind of childish prank. The force with which these children were actually supported by the elders. So Basavanappa and Rudrappa were constantly in the background urging these youngsters to impose certain kinds of fines, to impose certain forms of behavior on visiting government officials, to insist that people write slogans on the walls even when they were reluctant to do so. So there was an element of force that was exerted by these rich, wealthy, and extremely powerful men, although they remained a little bit in the background, and the foregrounding of the children may have been deliberate. So some of those who actually remember, there is an exhaustive set of oral interviews that have been done by the historian Surinath Kamath called Swatantra Sangramada Smritigalu, and in that there are many people who participate in the freedom movement who have been interviewed by him, and they include, of course, people from Isoor. So they remember that the children were foregrounded with intent, and that may be true too, that they knew that if there was any punishment for the actions that they undertook, children would be exempt because they were underage. So it's possible that the children were foregrounded here because they were protecting themselves from a certain kind of state action. These, on the 25th of September, the Shanbhog and the Patel of the area actually visit this village to demand the payment of the revenue, and they are attacked by these boys and several other children who also joined these boys. They were asked to wear Gandhi caps with the slogan that was written at the entrance of the village, which said, Be Javabdari Adhikarigalge, Barakudadu, they should not enter this village. Bandare, and that's a threat. If you do come, dot, dot, dot. So this Shanbhag and Patel were humiliated. They were asked to surrender their jobs, to submit their resignations, as it were. They are, and in fact, it's interesting that when one of the Patels returns to actually submit his resignation, he goes straight to the sahukar house. They are told by these young boys that they were not servants of the Raj, but servants of the people. Don't you know, these boys asked him, that Isoor is a Congress village? And in fact, the signboard actually declared that you are entering the independent village of Isoor. Now, if you look at the slogans that were up on the walls of the temple, if we can go back to that for just a moment, you will see that many of these are not all of them are necessarily anti-colonial. There are some that are anti-colonial about, not paying the revenue and so on. But quite a lot of them are addressed to people to reform themselves, to be prepared for, running this new nation in terms of relinquishing your interest in alcohol and in cigarettes and so on and so forth. But of course, there is an element of the anti-colonial as well. And here I want to come to an important thing that we must note, which is that the don't pay revenue demand, don't pay kandaya, would have had very little or limited value in a multi-caste village. I began, if you remember, telling you that most of those who were in this village did not own land. They were mostly laborers or people who leased in land. So the kandaya demand wouldn't have actually affected them. It would have been more worthwhile if they had been told that you should not pay rent to the landlord. But there was no such call. No such call was made to stop paying rent to the landlord. It is not, in other words, and I'll come back to this point again towards the end, it was not a movement that was going to enable any resetting of relationships within the village. It was very much mobilizing people for this anti-colonial kind of, thrust, as it were. There were exhortations to promote communal harmony in a village where there was no communal, dissonance. Witness after witness declared that there has never been any kind of communal dissonance. If there is anything, it is really between the Lingayats themselves, any kind of, disturbance. But nevertheless, this demand, which is obviously an echo of a national demand, even if it didn't have any material meaning in this particular location, was echoed for what it is. Wear khadi, speak Hindi, etc. All these are things which are naturally coming from the, and here I don't have that particular map, but the influence was very strong from Bombay, Karnataka, where obviously the national movement was very, very strong. And there it is British ruled territory. So these slogans kind of have a certain meaning there. They are echoed here. Even though there was a slogan that you should wear khadi, Basvanappa was known to wear a hat and a coat. I'll show you the picture of Basvanappa. He never gave up his hat and a coat, and this is Basvanappa on the left, and his tie. So this is obvious contradiction, and they came up for discussion at meetings which were held in Shikaripur, but then it was quickly stifled. So, I want to foreground these kinds of contradictions. So Basvanappa's obvious, contradiction with the very demand which was being made in the Isoor village was quickly silenced. So the don't pay kandaya demand is, as I said, going to have very limited value in a multi-caste village where most people don't themselves anyway pay kandaya. It would benefit only the landlords, not the tenants. But what we have in this space of this short time between 25th of September and 28th, you have a series of other events. So the threatening of the Shanbag and the Patel, which happened on the 25th, was became even worse and more exaggerated when the Tehsildar and the sub-inspector visited the village on the 28th. At that time, what happened was, and as you can see from the names that I have put up on the slide, these two officials were beaten, mocked, tied up, and left in that heat to finally die. So the Tehsildar Chennakrishnappa and the sub-inspector Kenche Gowda were both killed by this mob, which included some 50 or 60 children, 15 or 16 women, and lots of men of various different castes. And of course, once the deaths happen, and then the policeman who accompanies this party actually escapes because he wants to save his own life. So he just escapes. And what happens at the same time is that Sahukar Basvanappa, Rachavali Rudrappa, Shantavirappa, and Angadi Halappa, all of them disappear underground. So they desert the village at its hour of need. When the police actually come on hearing about the death of these two officials, they find only the women and the castes which were involved in the lynching, of course, and these young boys and so on. So they take in these people. So Basvanappa, Rachavali Rudrappa, Angadi Halappa, Shantavirappa, they all go underground. Then there is the arrest, there is the trial, and to cut a very long story short, of course, these are the 5 people who were tried and hanged. I've put their caste affiliation in brackets for you to see that they really were other kind. They were not the Lingayat landlords, as it were. Gurappa was a Vishwabrahmin. Mallappa was an ordinary peasant, Lingayat, no doubt. Suryanarayanachar was a goldsmith. Halappa was probably mistaken for Angadi Halappa and taken in. And Shankarappa was Devanga. There were also 3 women who were imprisoned for life. One of them was Halamma, who was the second wife of Sahukar Basvanappa. Siddhamma, who who was beholden to Basanappa because he helped her when she was outcast by the Sadhrus and helped her to bury her mother and so on. Parvati Amma, who was a wage laborer, and I'm told we have amongst us one of the descendants of Parvati Amma here today. So this, I'm trying to talk here about the divergence between those who were very, very strong and clear and were among the leaders of this movement, established this independent government, though it only lasted for 3 days because the police action was swift, the police action was violent and very severe, and as you can see, the courts actually, the Sessions Court tries these people. Sundara, there were 2 courts because they went on appeal to a special court as well, and some of them were, their hanging sentences were converted to life imprisonment. But what you see here in the course of this trial is a discussion of all the kinds of relationships in the village that would have brought tensions to the foreground, which the judge was interested in exploring because he wanted to establish it only as a crime and not as a political act. So every attempt was made in the course of this hearing to portray this event and the set of events as plain murder, that it was not anything that was informed by any kind of nationalist ideology, and that it was plain and simple, murder, and that many kinds of local circumstances led to this murder. So the village factions, the solidarities, the handing over of power to these 2 surrogates. In no other Prati Sarkar, by the way, I mentioned Tamluk, Talcher, Satara, and so on. In no other Prati Sarkar was there a handing over to surrogates in this fashion. So, was it a continuation rather than an overturning of local power structures? As I said, students were a very major part of Quit India, no doubt. Many of you may even come from families whose parents had, quit school and college in order to participate in the Quit India movement. But in this case, it was a very interesting kind of generational shift, which is almost as if the youngsters are anticipating taking over power in this village, where their power is, of course, ensured even after independence. Now, while the judges are, going through this voluminous evidence and so on and so forth, there are some things that we learn about the relationships and about how they were being characterized. So one has to do with the idea of masculinity. The fact that the men were actually, taking on the airs of being extremely brave and, powerful. There are phrases which are used which seem to suggest that they were invoking certain kinds of local forms of masculinity in terms of slapping their thighs and so on and so forth, threatening and so on and so forth. But more than the question of masculinity, it was the lack of femininity amongst the women who were actually tried and punished that affected the judges much more. And I want to say a few words about this lack of femininity that the judges were so struck by. First of all, the judges were very struck by the fact that this rebellion is happening in a princely state. It's not even a state or a region that is directly ruled by the British. How can this happen in Mysore, which is known as a very peaceful state, where a place where people get on very well, there has never been major conflagrations of any kind. Suddenly you have the emergence of this eruption, as it were, which ends in such tragedy. And so they cannot understand how peaceful Mysore is behaving like the riotous Bombay, Karnataka. But of course, there were influences from Bombay, Karnataka. They were coming and they were holding meetings. They were speaking to people and so on. So that was one thing that surprised the judges. The second was, as I said, the women who participated in the rebellion. They said, even women and children belonging to the well-to-do families in the village took part in the attack, and they could not understand this. Why would the well-to-do families send their women and children to participate in an attack of this kind? There were 50 or 60 children, as I said, in the crowd that was attacking these two officials, including a large number of girls. And the Zamiruddin Sharif, who was the police inspector, who, as I said to you a little earlier, had run away from the scene because he wanted to save his life, said that there were 15 women in the crowd when the violence began, and he said none of them was crying. Here is a sign of, absolute lack of femininity. And the judge says about Halama that she has taken a prominent part in attacking these people, and there is evidence to show that when the injured and the dying people wanted water, she refused to give water to them and offered them urine instead. She is a diabolical woman. She looks thin in build and dwarf in structure, but she is capable of all the things attributed to her. And of course, she was, as you can see, condemned to life imprisonment. So they went on at great length commenting on the agency of the women in performing or perpetrating this act of violence, which surprised them because that was not their idea of what Mysore women's femininity was all about. But at the same time, in another part of the judgment, Dasi really, who was the special judge which reviewed the sessions judgment, said that there are absolutely no extenuating circumstances in favor of any of the accused whom I have convicted of murder, except in the case of A10, that is Halama, and A37, that is Siddhama. They are women, and by nature, they would not have taken part in such a ghastly and diabolical crime. Clearly, they were put up to it, unless they were obliged by the male members of their household or of the unlawful assembly. So somewhere they were goaded into taking actions which were completely against their feminine nature. This was what some part of the judgment also said. But at the same time, in the same breath rather, they would say there's nothing womanly about what the accused did, except for their physical attributes, that they are actually women, but otherwise there's nothing womanly about them, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of discussion about how uncharacteristic such actions were in a village where these women, at least 2 out of the 3 of them, belonged to fairly well-to-do families and who therefore had no reason to participate in a struggle of this kind. It is interesting that the women did not get any defense witness from their marital families. Neither Halama, who was married to none other than the sahukar Basanappa, nor Parvatiyamma, nor Siddhama got a support from their marital families. And in fact, when the trial, when they were finally released, which happened only in 1945, they went back to their natal homes, not to their marital families. Parvatiyamma, who was the only laborer there amongst these 3, got no support from any side. She did not have a single defense witness. She was completely abandoned by all those who might have goaded her into this action. So it's actually quite sad and tragic that these people paid, in the case of the women, of course, they only had this imprisonment, but they paid very bitterly, very high costs for having participated in this event. It was said that the Isoor peasantry were temporarily deranged, that deprived them of their humanity, leaving the 2 officials with their thumbs tied to this pile of wood for 4 hours or more in the heat until they died without water and without any other form of succor. So, as I said, the judges expressed shock that such a violent thing can happen in a princely state which is known to be quite peaceful. And they said the punishment, therefore, has to be exemplary because we cannot see a repeat of this kind of action anymore. And interestingly and surprisingly, there was a similar kind of attack on officials that happened in Shravanabelagola not much later. It is un-Mysorean. It is savage. This is savage. This savagery is un-Mysorean. This was what the judges concluded. Now, let's just go back a little bit to see what it was that the upper caste Lingayats found attractive about the national movement. They had thrown their weight behind the national movement as early as 1930. They had allied with the Lingayats of the Karnataka region. Karnataka region was extremely, full of nationalist activity, and there was, in fact, a very specific form of satyagraha that was practiced in the Karnataka region. I'm talking about Bombay, Karnataka, where there were anti-landlord and where there were anti-revenue demands made. So, of course, it was attractive to those who were large payers of revenue, as I have already mentioned. There was no demand in these struggles against caste or against rent. These were non-existent. And the lower castes were naturally, as I have already mentioned, absent from this struggle. Nor were there any visible communal tensions. But it is not at all insignificant that the Muslims also stayed away from any participation in this big struggle of 1942. Even though some of the Muslim laborers bore witness to people like Urshantappa and so on, the landlords. And, we don't know whether they were coerced into providing that kind of testimony, but they definitely did not participate in any of the nationalist struggles. By this time, the Muslims of Mysore as well were estranged from the national movement. So, by and large, we can say that the signs and symbols of this rebellion were to really uphold rather than to transform or overturn the power structure of the village. And there is a certain continuity to older modes of power. No new, in other words, this movement was not necessarily imagining a new community, a new independent community, a new form of democracy, or anything like that. It was only imagining a transfer of power from older to younger elites. And the deployment of the boys is actually a very significant feature of this transfer of power that we can, we can deduce from this series of events. Now, why what I am saying is a little different. It's not as if the Isoor case has not been studied or written about. Surinath Kamath himself is somebody who has written about it. And in fact, when I presented this work at a conference, the Karnataka Historical Conference some years ago, he stood up and had called my presentation The Unspeakable Violence of Isoor. And he said, what's unspeakable about it? We have written about it and there's nothing further left to be said about Isoor. So what are you going to say or tell us that is new? And of course, he was silenced after I did speak. But the reason why he felt this strong sense of umbrage is because Isoor has only been recovered as a nationalist struggle in which the nationalist rebels were actually severely, punished and repressed. The other side of the story, it is the violence of the law that is focused on in almost all accounts of the Isoor struggle. The nationalist accounts emphasize the violence of the law. And of course, there's no doubt the law took very stern, strong, and very violent action against those who had committed this particular act. So there has been this very easy assimilation of this incident into the annals of nationalist history because they experienced the ferocity and violence of the law. They dwell, therefore, very little on the law of violence, which actually produced this unprecedented and even unpremeditated turn of events. Every time, so there is a very touching memoir written by somebody who actually was alive, who survived this incident, was imprisoned but later was released, C. Lingappa. He has written a very personal memoir, very touching and extremely detailed memoir, in which he says that there was no proper training in nonviolence. That's why this event actually took place, because people were not necessarily trained in Gandhian modes of nonviolence. And the judge himself said this, that if the people had satisfied themselves with the Congress creed of nonviolence, this unfortunate incident would not have happened. So somewhere there was a failure on the part of A, the leadership, and partly B, the people themselves, in imbibing the lessons of nonviolence that had been so long and loudly preached by Mahatma Gandhi. The truth, however, of this crowd action lies somewhere between the purely criminal and the purely political. The surrogates, of course, paid the heaviest price, as we have seen from the list of people who were hanged. The chief investigators, interestingly enough, survived to live fuller lives. Rachavari Rudrappa and his son Shantavirappa emerged from the jungles in March 1943 to surrender before the police after the death of Basavanappa in hiding. Acquitted by the higher court in 1943, Rudrappa did not serve his sentence, while his son's sentence was drastically reduced to just 4 years. The 5 martyrs were the dispensable heroes of the event. And it's interesting that, as I said, almost all the historians who've talked about Isoor, starting with the congressman who went to investigate the violence that had been perpetrated by the police on the village of Isoor, focused entirely on police violence. They just refused to deal with or talk about the violence of the nationalist mob itself. So somewhere there was a way of the nation actually forgetting this particular aspect of violence. And what has happened, so I had this on a slide which I didn't realize, so you can see that. What has happened since? When I went to Isoor to actually do a little bit of historical fieldwork, I, of course, saw the memorial to the 5 people who had been hanged right at the entrance to the village. And you have an even more interesting slab in the temple, which I would like to go to. This is actually Huchirayappa, who was one of the survivors of the Isoor struggle. He died just a few years ago, and he's standing in front of the memorial to the 5 who were hanged. This is, of course, when the women and others who were serving their imprisonment were actually released. Isoorna Swatantra Horatagararu, this kind of commemorative photograph. But this is the tablet that I found most interesting, which was established in 1984 when the Veerabhadra Swami temple was completely renovated. What it does is to bring all the kinds of casualties of this moment into a sort of new, I guess, post-independence form of citizenship. So what it says, it starts by saying that this tablet is actually commemorating the memory of all those who actually participated in this struggle. And that is, those who were hanged are the ones who are right on top. But just below that is the Pranarpisida Adhikarigalu. So the 2 officials who were killed, they sacrificed their lives. That's how it says, right? It's Pranarpisida Adhikarigalu. So they sacrificed their lives. It doesn't sort of attribute, the forces to which that sacrifice actually happened. And Bhugata Karyakartaru are those who went underground. They have also been commemorated in the slab, which brings the 5 who were hanged, the 2 who were lynched, and the men who simply disappeared, leaving their women to face, the women and other, men of other castes, to face the music, as it were, are commemorated in the slab, brought back, as it were, into the nationalist memory as people who will need to be remembered for their heroism. So this is a certain kind of suturing of the narrative to conveniently forget about that act of, or at least to paper over that act of violence which was perpetrated by the people of Isoor themselves. I was looking, I was interested to find when I was looking through the internet yesterday that a park has now been established in Anjanapura, which is a few miles, as you know, from Isoor, to commemorate Isoor. And it is full of, the statues and heroic figures of that time, not too many women there. This bucolic rural life has been portrayed by this sculptor called Solabakanawar, and it was established in 2014-15. Yediyurappa, whose constituency this is, had actually gone to Isoor and had promised that he would turn it into a dattograma, and everything would work, and they would be remembered for their valiant sacrifices during the freedom movement and so on. Nothing has happened to that kind of his commitment either. So I'm interested, as I said, in particular to look at the way in which this event has been memorialized in the contemporary. One of the interests I had was in looking at this and in focusing, as I said, in trying to understand what it is that led the Gandhian message to be so dramatically transformed into its opposite, and yet somehow also forgotten as perhaps a necessary price that one has to pay on the path to freedom. I want to end my presentation today by saying, going back to something that I had said right at the start of these 4 lectures. And that is what I said was an interest that I have in forging anew what Jacques Rancière had described as the shameful kinship between storytelling and history writing. I hope, though, I have been able to share with you over these 4 lectures that history is not just storytelling. It is much more, and of course it is very much a question of trying to make sense of and to make meaning of what might have happened in the past. So it's as much interpretation than storytelling. But I end on this note because when I went to do my field work, the year I think was 1998 or 99, to Ninasam, which was having its annual conference, Ninasam being in Hegodu in Shimoga. I was going to the conference and then going off to do the field work. I met U.R. Ananthamurthy. He was not somebody I knew very well, but I shared this information with him that I was actually going to investigate the struggle that had happened in Isoor, and he was fascinated by the story. But then I said to him, that independent Sarkar lasted only for 3 days. And he responded as only a storyteller can respond. He said, but if somebody living in Isoor had died on the 3rd day, he would have thought that India had become independent. So I end on that note, that the power of storytelling is its own, and it's something that perhaps we have to relearn in our times. Thank you very much for your patience and for especially those who have been more regular attendants to these lectures. But happy to take your questions.
Good evening, my name is Purnima. I just wanted to check why that tablet that you were so interested in didn't have any women's names at all, although your previous slide did have all the women's names. So if it's, as you said, being...
That is my slide.
I know, but...
They are not commemorated in that same way. There is that photograph of them being released. But otherwise, the heroes are the men. Oh, sorry.
Did they realize that? I mean, is that consciousness there when you also met Huchavirappa and, you've had that conversation? I mean, is it just the men who are sort of consciously commemorated?
The men are commemorated in a way that is perhaps not unexpected, even though they were, as I said, not present. The fact that they were actually in hiding while the women and children and many of the other lower castes were facing the music. So yeah, this is one of the ironies, no? That's why I'm saying to you that, that's why I hesitate to present this, because in some ways it looks like I'm deriding the national movement, but I'm not. I'm just saying that it took so many different forms in different parts, and this is the form that it took, that it actually mobilized some of the richest and the most powerful people for, in a movement which they saw direct benefits from. And they were successful in mobilizing people who may not have had such a direct kind of interest in participating, except that there perhaps was some degree of coercion. I would therefore, question this idea that there was a nationalist sentiment, certainly amongst those who came from Bombay, Karnataka, and were propagating nationalist ideals. But you can see from the very big jumble of slogans and so on and so forth that there was a very kind of, what was filtering through was a very distorted, perhaps, idea of what nationalism would actually yield. It's interesting that, there was, as I said, a mixture of things which were directly attacking officials, officialdom and government power, but also there was this call to reconstitute yourself and to purify yourself and so on and so forth, which is very much part of the Gandhian message, of course. But how it gets refracted in this population is what interests me. What are the kinds of ways in which it compelled them to work, to act. But even more interesting is how that is remembered, that, there is a certain suppression of that mob violence that is happening in this. There's no attempt to confront it and to talk about it.
Yeah. Hello. So it was certainly very interesting for me to know about women having the agency and them actually being a major part of the perpetration. Because when I had read about it, it was just that women were left behind when the leaders went into hiding, and that women were just like passive spectators of what happened. So this was a sort of like a eye-opening thing. And my question is, like, after the people were tried, what was the sort of administration that happened with the village? Was there some form of like more police control of the village?
After 28th September, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, of course, the police completely occupied the village, and men had more or less disappeared. Only that's very common, as you know, when there's some sort of confrontation. Usually, the men will just disappear, and only women or children are left behind. So it took a while for people to return to their out of sheer fear. So the police repression was definitely very, very great and strong. And as I said, that's what the nationalist accounts all focus on. They focus on the police repression, they focus on the hangings as the sign of, brutal governmental power. But let me correct you on one thing which you started by saying. Gandhi's greatest achievement, especially since the non-cooperation movement of 2022, is that he mobilized, was able to bring large numbers of women into the national movement. Into public political nationalist activity for varieties of causes and reasons and so on and so forth. Starting with, the sacrifice and bonfire of imported cloth, but also attacking toddy shops, or rather demonstrating in front of toddy shops and so on and so forth. So women were seen very much as those who possessed the moral authority to do those kinds of things. So that was the greatest achievement of Gandhi in the early 20s. And that continued through the civil disobedience movement as well as in 1942. So in all the three big waves of nationalism, women were very much a part of the national movement. They were not bystanders. So in one sense, Isoor is not that exceptional, that there are women who are participating and so on.
Yeah, I think what struck me was obviously the revolt taking place within a princely state. So it got me thinking.
I'm sorry?
The revolt taking place within the princely state of Mysore, right? So just got me thinking, what was the people's imagination of the princely state? Did they see it as an extension of the colonial enterprise? Did they see it as an like an obstacle in the path to independence?
I think by the 40s, you're right. I mean, that's an interesting question because by the 40s, I think quite a lot of people are, and especially the more remote parts, you know, the further north you go, like Shimoga, which is northern Mysore, were less beholden to the Maharaja in that sense and perhaps more willing to see through what princely rule was really all about, to enough to feel that they must too part. And by this time already there is a Mysore State, Mysore Pradesh Congress Committee. It's not that the Congress is completely absent in Mysore, but it is very, very restricted and it's very, very confined to some regions. In this case, the major influence was actually coming from Bombay, Karnataka. So and on all the actions that were happening in Bombay, Karnataka, the Karnataka, what was called the Karnataka form of Satyagraha and so on was very much, and that was quite a violent, set of events, especially in 42. So they were mimicking many actions that were taking place in Bombay, Karnataka. This is not to say that other parts of Mysore did not participate. They also participated in cutting telegraph wires and disrupting railways and traveling ticketless and leaving school and college and going on strike and so on. That went on right up until September or October of 1942. But then it kind of peters out. So yeah, the short answer is yes, they're seeing through princely rule as something which is just, they are seeing the paramount power of the British as something that needs to be opposed even in a princely state.
Bombay, Karnataka, you keep saying that.
Beg your pardon?
When you say Bombay, Karnataka,
Yeah.
which area is that? Pardon my ignorance.
Yeah, that is this area of Dharwar and, the Kannada-speaking regions across the border of
Mysore.
across the border of Mysore. There were regions which were part of Hyderabad, Karnataka. There were regions which were part of Bombay, Karnataka.
Later on, they became part of
which
Karnataka.
later on became part of the unified Karnataka state.
Fair enough.
So you actually cleared up my debate with him that they shouldn't have had any kind of issue with the princely kingdom. But there was some kind of a situation even in the Mysore kingdom that the king was kind of not taking care of the affairs in the way he should. You know, the Mirza Ismail case and the issue that the Ganesha riots that happened in Bangalore. So
That was much earlier, in 1928.
yeah, so Mysore kingdom also had its own issues and all that. But in this case, obviously the influence came from Bombay, Karnataka, where they were confused. But another point is that it seems the violence was an accident. The thing is that the sub-inspector or somebody who came in shot in the air, and that created a confusion that he was shooting near the school. And they got kind of agitated because of that.
No, that is true. There is a prehistory of, there is a certain kind of course, this is what they would actually dwell on, right? They would have this kind of narrative of actually having been attacked and so on and so forth. But the train of events is such that yes, you're absolutely correct, and I said this myself, that it is unprecedented and it is unpremeditated also. It's not as if it is some sort of planned lynching that happens. There is anger about the fact that these people have entered into a place which was declared as an independent village, and whether or not the firing in the air actually happened is a question of some doubt, but definitely there was provocation of a kind that people felt they would not tolerate at that moment. So it was the strength of the mob that actually gets displayed in this kind of action.
Yeah, another small clarification that Lady Parvatama Parvati Amma, she's not actually a laborer. She also belongs to the upper class families there. They are all, most of the Lingayats are all related. That,
They may have been, but as far as the court record goes, she is listed as someone
that
who was
could be a little
laborer.
fudging or something like that,
Beg
because
pardon?
most of them in the village were all related. Because as you said, the actual perpetrators were all from the upper class.
Yes.
And most of the Lingayat people are all related. Other than the Nodamas and the Sadars, they were all related people. They were all related families.
I'm curious how this event was viewed by the nationalist movement in other parts of the country. I think you mentioned that they largely did not want to talk about the violence, but was there any outright condemnation of the violence and the lynching?
No, no. See, it's not a very well-known incident beyond Mysore. Okay, so most of the writings that have happened in Kannada and to some extent in English as well. But it's more or less part of the narrative of Mysore's nationalist struggle. So, there has not been, I mean, this has been excused. As I said, the most sympathetic way of understanding it is by someone like Lingappa, who says that people were not trained in nonviolence. And that's why this incident happened. But because the state responded in such with even more violence, it became completely justified not to have to deal or speak about the initial violence either. So in some ways, it's not something that has been talked about in quite the same way as, say, for instance, Chauri Chaura.
Hi. I was just wondering that the way that you relate the incident and the way that it was viewed by the judiciary, by the state, it sounded like they viewed it as something which was uncharacteristic of the people. You used the word derangement. So this view of it in terms of, uncharacteristic violence, there wasn't as much emphasis on the fact of the declaration of independence, of that being unusual and that being unique. That did not come up even later by the nationalists who focused on the violence aspect.
No, yes, of course.
Okay.
So the interest of the judge is, as I said, only to establish the crime. So, they are not going to be interested in saying they will do their utmost to prevent it from being understood as a political act.
Sure.
And to produce it as a pure crime. The interests of the nationalists will, on the other hand, be only to establish that it was a political act and not a crime really at all. And that, so there are two kinds of parallel and opposing accounts of this. What I tried to do was to provide some sort of third way of understanding what happened and taking equally seriously both the violence by what I've called the law of violence in the village itself, as well as the violence that was experienced by the village as a consequence of state repression. So, they are both there. Both have two different interests in establishing the prehistory of what actually happens.
Thank you. So this view of it as a murder, it did not translate anywhere into policy in terms of governance. Mysore was seen as a model state. Other princes would come to learn, right? So this was not considered so important. It was just considered, a derangement. Is that how it stayed in the memory of the state?
I don't think it disturbed the well-established idea that Mysore was a model state. I don't think it disturbed that at all. As I said, it was seen as a blip on the screen sort of thing, uncharacteristic, not something that is premeditated and so on and so forth. So it didn't disturb that. And anyway, by the 40s, there was, as I said, if you look at other kinds of things that were unfolding in Mysore, including the very violent not violent, but with very strong opposition of the colonial powers to what Mysore wanted to achieve independently in terms of establishing, for example, the car factory and so on. There was a capacity amongst the people to actually see through princely rule and the claim to modernity and model stateness and so on and so forth, to see what colonial rule was really all about. So there was, by the 40s, I would say, some of that enchantment with Mysore as being a model state and so on had more or less browned off. I mean, it had worn off. And the fact that Jayachamraj Vadiyar comes to the throne and that he is less, I mean, in fact, it was the bureaucrats versus the king in the case of the car factory, because Visheshraya and Mirza wanted the car factory very badly, and Jayachamraj was not willing to risk his position to actually support that demand. So there was some sort of distance that was developing even between the very progressive kind of bureaucracy that Mysore had and the official sort of monarch as well by the 40s.
Thank you, Janaki, for this very granular account. As you point out, I mean, I'm not so struck by the role of the women. As you pointed out, the participation of women in other parts of the country has been extensively covered, including extremely radical, violent actions, as we know in Bengal.
Yes.
So in fact, it's not that. It's the children that I'm struck by. You say 8 years old, you say 10 years old. Is it that we need to rethink our conceptions? We've done this childhood work together. Do we need to rethink our understanding of what is a child at this point in time, even though it's the 1940s? That 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds could indeed be
10 and 12.
10 and 12, okay. 10 and 12, even then, could be spokespersons, not just shoved in front. But as you described, they're actually questioning, they're interrogating. So I'm just trying to put in place our understanding of childhood. And what
So
that
let
might
me
have
start
meant.
by saying, and I said this in passing, maybe it wasn't made as strongly as I should have, but Quit India was one moment when a lot of children did participate by leaving school, leaving college and so on. So, that is below, say, 14, 15. Children would actually leave school. People remember this act of participating in Quit India through leaving their schools, traveling ticketless, participating in cutting wires and so on. So it definitely there was a large participation of students in Quit India, which was unlike the previous two moments of non-cooperation and civil disobedience. So that's the bigger picture. But I think, and I'm risking something here when I say this, that in this particular instance, this surrogate power, which was being wielded by these two children, in the case of landlord families, may not be that unusual, that they would actually assume some forms of power from a very early age, and that they are actually miniature adults in some ways. They're not really children in that sense, because they're waiting to participate in, just like laborers' children will actually participate in work, you would have landlords' children actually participating in, some of that power and the glory of being important. We hear throughout the trial that Basanappa and Rudrappa were constantly exhorting the children about what they should do. And we're providing definitely the spine of this resistance, as it were. But yes, they did have independent power, as when they took the topis off the Shanbag and the Patel and made them wear Gandhi topis and so on and so forth. So they were really exercising a sort of power in anticipation of the power that they would enjoy as adults, perhaps.
Janaki, thank you very much for that. I'm actually trying to make sense of, put this in context of two of your earlier lectures. You had the insurgent peasant, you had the workers in Kolar, and you have this incident. And to me, I find this the most bizarre of them all. The peasant insurgency, we can clearly understand why it was happening. Right? With the squeezing of revenue, the miserable conditions under which they were living. Kolar, once more, we can understand, not so much from the economic pressures they were facing, but the snatching away of their dignity, right? And their identity even, the appropriation of their identity by somebody else through their fingerprints. This seems to me, and this is what I'm trying to understand a little bit more, an almost random, not very well thought out act. The leaders, whoever they were, seem to have disappeared. The state finds a few scapegoats, makes examples of them, and then life seems to return back to normal. And this is the way I see it. I may be missing something, but...
No, I hope I've not communicated this idea that there was no ideological influence at all that was felt, even in a place like this, of nationalist struggles. I think that one should not minimize the importance of the nationalist message that was filtering through to different parts of the country, and even states like Mysore, directly and indirectly. Directly, as I said, people were coming from Bombay, Karnataka, and giving talks in places like Shikaripur and Chirchugundi and so on and so forth, maybe not in Isoor itself. But these were attended by people like Basavanappa and Rudrappa and so on, including Angadi Halappa and so on. So there was definitely nationalist influence. How it gets translated within the village itself into forms of action. So, you know, the Prabhat Feri is not something to be ignored. The Prabhat Feri is actually a very important mobilizational tactic. It travels through, and this happened all across the country. The Prabhat Feri was happening. People would gather early in the morning. They would chant these songs, these nationalist songs, march through the village. Whether others participated or not, they would hear the same message. So there was a certain kind of influence that exercised. And there would be slogans. And, you know, some of these would be slogans of that Gandhi had put into circulation and so on and so forth. Like this, like the Quit India. So I don't think we should minimize the effects of more nationalist mobilization even in a village like Isoor. Definitely there was nationalist mobilization of a very important kind which was filtering through to this location, even though it was within princely Mysore. What, as I keep repeating, and as my friend here also said, this is an unprecedented and unpremeditated act. The act of the violence itself is unpremeditated. I don't think they imagined that somebody would actually die on their hands. It happened. But there was cruelty of a kind that was shown that was in some ways seen as a form of rough justice, you know, against a power that was exerting itself on this village. So the skepticism that might have been, the skepticism that might have prevailed amongst, say, tenants and laborers against the don't pay kandaya demand would in some ways dissolve at that moment, where there would be a new kind of solidarity, that there is someone who's kind of is likely to perpetrate violence and has come armed and so on and so forth, and therefore must be divested of their arms and also punished in certain ways, produces some kind of unity, a very momentary kind of unity of the community. I have tried to suggest that there were many groups we need to take equally seriously those who did not participate. And I try to understand why the nationalist message did not reach them. So here too, the explanations perhaps lie beyond Mysore, you know, why the Muslims didn't participate. Definitely has to do with the fact that by the 1940s, the Muslims were estranged from the national movement. This didn't mean that they actually intervened to actually prevent this kind of violence, but that they were indifferent to the call of Gandhi at this moment. Yeah.
I'm a bit intrigued by, you know, Mysore. We've always grown up hearing of it as a model state. And you mentioned it also now. Though in your first lecture, you talked about the peasants rebelling against this Maharaja who had absolutely no care or concern for them. So how and why is Mysore actually considered a model state?
That is all very much a post-1881 when it is restored to the Maharaja. You know, after 50 years of direct British rule between 31 and 81, it is finally restored to this extremely reconstituted, refashioned Maharaja, Chamaraja Wadiyar X, and subsequently Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar, who is tutored in the ways of, well, I've explained this also in terms of the strength of the bureaucracy and the fact that the bureaucracy played a very big role in imagining this modern Mysore, whether as an economic kind of power or as a socially more equalizing kind of power. All these are happening only in the 20th century, actually. Certainly the first few decades of the 20th century that you have these kinds of developments and this appellation of it being one. The model state appellation is given by the British. It's not something that once it is given, then of course it is claimed as their own. But it's very much something that has its roots in the British rewarding certain kinds of states and encouraging that kind of association with modernity and forward-looking and progressive and so on and so forth.
I have a brief comment and a question after that. This peasant rebellion that you talked about that occurred in the 1830s and 40s was in the same district. I don't know how far Isoor is from.
Yeah.
I wondered if there was some memory of that was carried over in some sense, folk tales or whatever. But my question is related to what someone here asked earlier, which was this judgment that was given in terms of crime and etc. that the judges did was something similar to what happened during the emergency. And I'm talking about the Baroda dynamite conspiracy when that came to trial. One of the explicit arguments that were made by the defense was that you have an inherent right to rebel, that there's under certain circumstances. I wondered if you want to comment on that, because that is very similar to what the judges did with respect to this SR case.
No, there is no trace of that kind of reasoning in this particular judicial text. Pardon?
I thought you said so.
That they have a right to rebel?
No. They didn't address that. They only looked at it as narrow criminal angle.
I didn't understand your question then, because I thought you're saying that the lawyers are arguing that they have a right to rebel. Is that what you're saying? I didn't quite understand your question.
No, the lawyers did argue that there's an inherent right to rebel, but I thought you made the point earlier that the judges in the Isoor case chose not to look at those kinds of, leanings of these people and looked at it from the purely criminal angle.
Yeah, that is definitely what I'm saying, that they were not interested in understanding what might have been the political motivation of any of the leadership, because it ended in a crime. So their focus was entirely on the crime, and the state having the the monopoly of committing that kind of violence. So anybody else who commits that kind of violence is a criminal. So that's the focus of the judge, and that's the focus of the judge in Chauri Chaura as well, or any such incident, where they try to downplay any kind of political motivation for what might have happened. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of interest in saying that these were, people. It was unexpected, no doubt, but that it was definitely something that was perpetrated through the events that the prehistory that was developed was one, like I told you, the slogan which the police translator is producing in court is directly enjoining you to cut government people to pieces. That is premeditation, right? Even if it is said casually, it is something that appears to have the aura of premeditation.
Thank you again for a fantastic talk. Just on this point about the inscription on, what you're describing as the slogan, is the only evidence we have from the court record? I mean, is it possible that some of the material that was being cited as being part of the sort of, motivation or the sort of, the way that the people were being trained actually also perhaps, fabrication? Just curious.
Which is fabrication?
The slogans on the temple, you know,
the slogans we have only access to from the police record. But of course, there are very, very touching memoirs. As I said, Lingappa's is one of them. Surinath Kamath has assembled oral histories, which are also memoirs, where people remember some of these slogans and so on. So they do remember that, you know, Khadi and speaking Hindi, etc. All these were parts of the slogans, the Prabhat Fairies, how they went around the village.
Right.
So there are these accounts which in some ways substantiate what the police record will say.
Like the cut to pieces part is what I mean.
Cut to pieces is something that is suppressed in these accounts.
Right.
You know? Yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah, you're right. We don't know. But I don't think it would have been introduced as something to establish.
Like mistranslation or, you know, sort of an inflation of the intent of
Right. It's possible. I mean, it's possible. But there was a hostility to the government official, and you know, many kinds of things were being said about government officials that may not have amounted to cutting them to pieces, but definitely divesting them of all symbols of power and making them accountable to the people, etc. So there was all that element as well.
So with that, thank you very much, and let's give Janaki a very big hand.